Excellent. So thank you and welcome to Is Data Neutral? Critical Questions about Bias and Equity. We are so excited to have you here for this really important and interesting conversation. As you are joining us, please introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us your name, your organization, and where you are joining us from. And we are going to get started. So just a little bit about me. I'm Jonathan Berry-Wolf, Marketing and Communications member of the Project Unicorn team. And I'll be starting us off with a few housekeeping items, the agenda, and a few topics of interest from Project Unicorn. So today we got the welcome and introductions. Then we are going to turn things over to our all-star panel for a conversation about data. Is data neutral? And we will be discussing that and many different facets of that topic with Susan Bearden leading the charge there. And finally, we will have open things up for Q&A and then finalize with some next steps. So as you are listening to the conversation, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A part of the webinar. If you put your questions in the chat, that works as well. We will be monitoring both as the session goes on. So be sure to put your questions in the chat. We will address them either as they come up or right at the end once things are final. A few little items from Project Unicorn. Project Unicorn is an organization dedicated to advancing and implementing data interoperability in K-12 EdTech tools. We have a pledge that you can sign that outwardly shows your support and the importance of the data interoperability journey. So if you're a school district leader or an EdTech vendor, please sign the Project Unicorn pledge. You'll gain access to resources, webinars like this, and technical assistance from our Project Unicorn team. So please sign up. Additionally, if you're an EdTech vendor here, apply for the Project Unicorn Interoperability Certification. It's a free tool offered in partnership with Digital Promise. And basically, it's free to apply for Project Unicorn signatories, and it helps to rank the interoperability of your EdTech tool. You'll receive a badge like you see on the screen, ranking the interoperability from 1 to 4, and you'll also receive some one-on-one technical assistance from the Unicorn team about how to continue to grow your score. Incredible free resource. You should definitely check it out. And finally, Project Unicorn is in the second year of its annual school system data survey. We're trying to take the pulse of data interoperability in K-12 schools nationwide. Our first survey resulted in the first annual State of the Sector report, which showed a lot of the areas that school districts are really thriving in, and some of the areas that we continue to need growth and improvement when it comes to data interoperability. And those survey results directly influence the kinds of programming that we and our partner organizations engage in. So this webinar and many others are a direct result of last year's survey. So please, if you're a school district tech leader, fill out the survey, and everyone who fills it out also gets a $25 Amazon gift card. So can't go wrong there. All of these links should be in the chat, and we will be following up with you afterwards so you can access all of these resources and programs. I'm going to briefly introduce today's speakers and then hand things over to Susan Bearden, the Director of Digital Programs at Project Unicorn, to continue the conversation. We have this all-star panel of people here talking with us today. Tashawn Christie, the Executive Director of Organizational Effectiveness at Kent School District, Beth Holland, Partner Research and Measurement at the Learning Accelerator, Jin-Soo Hub, Partner of the Parabola Project at the Learning Accelerator, and Sandra Paul, Director of Informational Technology at the Township of Union Public Schools. We are so excited you're here to have this conversation and to engage in this topic with us. Without further ado, I'll pass things over to Susan Bearden. Susan.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and welcome everyone for coming to today's webinar. I'm so excited about the conversation. When we had our planning session for this webinar, we started talking, and the conversation was so rich and so fascinating. I wish that we had hit record before we started talking, because that could have been a webinar in and of itself. So to that end, I'm actually going to start off by asking our panelists the question that kind of catalyzed our discussions in our planning call. The original title for this webinar was going to be Data is Not Neutral, Critical Questions About Bias and Equity. And during the conversation, we had some disagreements as to whether data is in fact not neutral. So that's why we ended up changing the title of our webinar to Is Data Neutral? So I'm going to invite our panelists to kick off by asking that question. Is data neutral? What do you think? And Tashawn, I'm going to start off with you, and please give us your thoughts.
So I appreciate that. I'm glad everyone was able to join us. And yeah, when that question was asked, I think I immediately went to some of the things that we have in our district as our data specific pledges, at least, or our data beliefs. And one of them is that data is neutral, right? And so it immediately conflicted with the fact that, okay, I'm about to be on a panel talking about data is not neutral, when one of our beliefs is that data is neutral. So how do I reconcile the two? And I figured, well, you need to have someone at least to have something to bounce against to fortify the initial topic. So for me, I've really focused in this space to say that data can be, I'll call it a fact. And one of the main reasons is that the concept of data maturity in a system always comes up in terms of how do they see this being a thing. And I've kind of always identified this progression as the data maturity and data use progression as descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive. And in this descriptive space, it kind of tells a story seen through the lens of culture. Like, how do you see your data? So descriptive. Predictive kind of points to potential next steps if nothing changes. So we can predict what's going to happen if absolutely nothing changes in the space. But prescriptive is this higher level data use based on your expected outcomes, and then what actions you should be taken based on that data. So I would hazard a guess and say that most places are in the descriptive phase, meaning that they have some dashboards, use them in standard ways to find interesting data, measure outcomes usually related to compliance or something related. But the challenge with descriptive data is that if it's in quantitative form, the context is often stripped away. So when we talk about neutrality, without that context, right? Context often being left to the viewer means that they will see outcomes through whatever lens that they currently have in place. All right, so data is a reflection of fact, and this is my opinion. And a note that I didn't say truth, but back to the point of lacking context, but fact. So when I say that data is neutral, that's what I mean. It's stating a fact at a moment in time. So people give it context and meaning, which shifts that neutrality. So my statement is that data in and of itself is neutral. People shift the neutrality of the data. So that was my response and kind of why I'm here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tashawn. Okay, I'm going to open up to the rest of our panelists. What do you think? Is data neutral?
Well, on the side of, being a director in using data, one of the things I know is that is just like Tashawn saying about being descriptive, and also, as we said, using it also for prescriptive purposes, because that's one of the things that a lot of educators are looking to do, is to use the what data we have. So using it on the level of descriptive, so that it can lead to a prescriptive format, so that we as educators, and well, for myself being a director of IT, know what we need to actually get. So the resources and investments to get an ROI on what you purchase to enable, some sort of prescription. But at the same time, and Tashawn knows, everybody here on this panel kind of understands, and he actually, you said it so eloquently, the context is missing. And sometimes there is, even though it is prescriptive, and it may be able to give you some ideas of what you could use or not use, it's still something missing, because there is a cultural aspect that could be missing. There could be a learning disability or even a methodology that can cause the prediction to be offset for a student. And, we're always looking at it in the sense of can it scaffold or differentiate the instructional process for a teacher? And the thing is that it can, but the problem is then it's very general and not really specifically made for a student. It's like not having an IEP or, individual educational plan for a student. So that's one of the things that I find with data. Don't get me wrong, I'm just like Tashawn. I do use the data and I do use it to kind of help me, be able to, for us to be able to get certain resources in the school district, but I do see the flaws of it.
Excellent. Thanks, Sandy. Jinsu or Beth, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that, I think we often say that, numbers don't lie, right? Like, and I think like to Sean's point, like that goes to like numbers are fact. Like we can say, yes, a student scored this percentage on a test. And that is just a statement of fact on there. I think that the hard part, like, we've been talking about is that the people add context and what data do we choose to present? How do we choose to visualize it? How do we, dig into the data? Like, do we look at different subgroups? How do we present that? And I think it's a challenge in education where, we collect a lot of data. Teachers are stretched, principals are stretched. Anyone working in education is stretched even before the pandemic. So you don't want to dump, here's the raw data, everyone, like take a look and figure it out yourself. You do want to create dashboards. You do want to make it easier on there, but that means that there are choices being made on what to present and how to present it. And that's where it can get really like tricky and like also like how far can you drill down on a specific piece of data if you are really interested in it? And so it's those human choices, the context that Tashawn was talking about that makes the data not neutral anymore. And so those choices are the ones that you really have to take a step back and ask, like, are we presenting the right data with the right visualizations?
And I think to the point, because I just want to follow up on something that Jinsu said. I think the word data has some baggage because it's been misused for a long time, right? There's this common definition of data, and you can break it down into quantitative assessments and such, and then qualitative, they're kind of these narratives. But what it really boils down to, again, is, what data are you using and for what purposes? Kind of understanding the fact that everything is data, but what is important to capture? Because when we talk about this being overloaded, there are some things that can probably help us to solve some of these challenges. But again, from your lens, it depends on what you feel is important. And if it's not aligned to any strategic plan or not aligned to what these expected outcomes are, then you're still in this descriptive phase and you're telling a story. And that story that you're telling is based on your experience, your knowledge, and your understanding, not necessarily aligned to anything. So I present a thing, that thing that I present is the same thing that's always been presented. The context is stripped away. Each person is able to kind of dig into that space. So I think that's really interesting is this everything is data, but what's important to capture?
I've been chomping at the bit. I was trying so hard to wait. And I think as the researcher in the group, when Susan and I first started talking about this conversation around the idea of data and equity, like I started with the idea of like data is not neutral, and the framing of it. And by the way, Tashawn, you're brilliantly eloquent as always. Like data can be descriptive, it can be prescriptive, or it can be predictive. And the focus that I had was on the prescriptive predictive piece. The first piece, just in training as a researcher, there's so often, the ways that we're trained as researchers, we're looking at essentially at data from a biased perspective. Like there's a long history of research coming from, a very narrow narrative, and so especially in education. So that was a piece of it. The other piece of it, having done a lot of reading into the idea of not just the data, but the algorithms behind it, and what are we doing with the data, and how can it be used in either prescriptive or predictive measures, and what bias is baked into the system. And that's where I guess we could say that we can blame the system, maybe not being neutral. And that comes back to Sean's great point on context. But as we're seeing more and more systems using this data, how are we making sure that we're really asking these questions about, is the data in the set neutral? So we could be more specific there. And are the algorithms that are determining what gets done with the data, like what is the potential bias or ramifications behind them? And I think as we move into this equity conversation, there's a lot to be said. An example I always like to use was one that a professor said to me one time, where if you gave a word scramble, and this group all did it, and I'm gonna have to type and talk at the same time, but if I gave everyone, did I do this right? Don't spell check me. If I gave everyone this word scramble and I asked you what you saw, and we can go ahead and do this, and everyone just type what they think that they've seen from this word scramble. This data is letters. Letters are in fact neutral, but I'm telling you that the word scramble could be unscrambled, and maybe there's only one right or wrong answer. What did you see? So for those of us who can see the chat, like, what word do you see? I will pause. And let people type.
Anybody hungry?
Oh no, it says they can't see it. Oh, that's because apparently I can't use Zoom. Let me do this one more time. I'm sorry. Thank you. Ken and Hillary, I'm sorry. Zoom fail.
Can you all see it in the chat?
I retyped it. Zoom fail.
Got it.
Woohoo. So great. We have coast,
Excellent.
coats, tacos. Awesome. So we can unscramble this in any sort of a way. When the question was originally phrased, it was provided to a group of students in California. They all answered tacos, and apparently the only answer was coats. So now we have this entire group of students who are told from the data that their answer was incorrect. And that would be that, predictive, or I don't know if that's predictive or prescriptive, Tishan, but it would be an answer. I love the fact that enough people have started to say coasts, because I never even saw that one originally. I'm in New England, it's cold. I said coat. But I think that's the piece of when we think about this neutrality of data, it absolutely, and Susan saw an ascot, which is too much historical drama. I think we do need to keep in mind, as Tishan said, like, what is the context? Yes, we can use it to see a truth in moment or a fact in moment. And then also, how are we making sure that we're really interrogating what it is that we're seeing to make sure that we are maintaining a sense of neutrality, and it allows us to be neutral when we're thinking about the decisions we might be making. That was a very long answer. I'm going to be quiet now.
No, that's great. And I was just so struck by that conversation, Jinsoo, you meant you didn't even think of ascot, whereas that was the first word I thought of. Again, I've been binging an awful lot of historical dramas on Netflix lately, and HBO. So Gilded Age, anyone? So that's probably why I went straight to that word. But I think that's a great example of how seemingly neutral data can be interpreted so many different ways, just based on the personal experiences and perspectives of the person who is looking at the data. And that kind of brings us to another aspect of conversation that we just sort of touched on during our webinar pre-conversation about implicit bias. And how can we make sure that educators and others who are analyzing education data are aware of their own implicit bias, and what are the potential impacts of implicit bias? And I'll throw that out to whichever one of our panelists wishes to start first.
The one thing I was going to say was that one of the things about implicit bias is that you have to understand yourself. And, you really have to be self-reflective and take a look at yourself and realize that you do have these issues, implicit bias, and be able to realize it, that as you're looking at data or you're looking at certain things, realizing that your point of view could be actually reflective of your implicit bias. And I remember before we even started this webinar, I remember talking to you about, I was brought up in the British educational system. So, I had to take certain courses and certain things that the American system is very different, just simple things as spelling certain words were very interesting. So because of that, one of the things is that I look at certain things from a different perspective, and I look at it from my cultural background and also from, how I was raised and everything else. So when I look at data, a lot of times I reflect on, okay, am I really projecting my bias on when I'm looking at the data? So because of that, like one of the things I did recently was started looking at the data of minority groups and also girls being in computer science. How many kids are in the engineering courses and computer sciences at our high school? And one of the things when looking at the data and everything else, and it's reflective as, as other schools within the United States, and also even in the employment, in that you could have a computer science with, just males and no females at all, or you land up having a situation like I know some of us have actually been in, where I go into a meeting and I'm the only minority female inside a meeting, an engineering meeting. So, these are different things, and realizing that, our students are going to be facing these type of issues, but also realizing that when I look at the data, I have to be very careful of how I run an analysis or give the context of what I think what the data is saying.
Yeah, I love that. That's kind of where my mind normally bounces to. And I think I'll ask kind of these two questions whenever I think about implicit bias: this recognition of where implicit bias may exist, and then what data do you have or keep that may give a clue where implicit bias might exist, and then coach out of that. And I think the example that I'll use is this idea of discipline data or behavior data. I've had people tell me we shouldn't call it, because in my system, we call it behavior data. And part of that is because I'm responsible for the data system. So that's what I call it, right? But when asking why, they usually say it paints the wrong picture about a student, right? And it carries over with the student throughout their whole history. And people will potentially treat them poorly based on what happened in the past. And I usually respond with, who said that it's about the student's behavior, right? And I know that that's a topic for another discussion probably, but I bring it up every time. So who said that we're talking about just the students? I just said behavior data, right? Because something that I've run across frequently over the years is incidents in your behavior data should be erased each year. I've had that argument pretty much every single year. And you have to think about it, because if your data just has the incidents, then you see what the student was recorded as doing, right? But you also should have an idea of, if you include consequences, then you can see what the system did as a result of the recorded action of the student, right? If you really break it down. So each one of these, but when you're thinking about it from a student relationship standpoint, each one of these incidents has the potential to be a traumatic incident for the student, right? So depending on the counts, there may be a disproportionate application of incidents to individual students, which really shows implicit bias. Like, let's say we have a group of students who did the same thing. This was their consequence. We have another group of students did that same incident, different consequence. What does that spell, right? So each one of these incidents, again, has the potential to be a traumatic incident for the student. So when you erase it, you don't have the opportunity to have this conversation about, so what did you experience, and what was the result of that? So implicit bias continues to stay in a space because it's not recognized in the data as a thing, depending on the lens that you apply. So again, when we think of the sum total of these incidents and a student trauma and creation of their belief in the place in that environment, which is school, then what we have to really think about is, what is our ownership of the data and our acceptance of the practices that surround that? Because if we understand the intent due to how a student is treated based on their history, right? So I understand the intent of removing that, right? Because we want to really get away from this. I don't want a student to be targeted, labeled, and tracked, right? But do we ask the questions about, what do the facts in the data tell us about implicit bias? And I think that rarely ever happens. So the neutrality in the data is dependent on the question, what responsibility are you taking, right? And then from where are you taking your actions from? So what lens, and again, from an implicit bias standpoint, I feel like this example kind of walks through several different aspects of it, and there's a lot there, and it's baked into education in some ways. But our reality is we really need to know why we're using the data and then understand where it can point to where our biases lie.
To Sean, this had me thinking, I actually was having this conversation with your team in a different context, but I was reminded of a quote from a book that I love that says, like, you have to see the system that produces the outcomes. And so to really understand what the outcome, what the end result is, you have to be able to look at it within the context of the entire system. And so with Tashawn's team, we were doing an exercise where we thought about how every single child, right, every student is inside a series of nested systems, right? So you have a child who's nested inside a classroom, which is nested inside of a school, which is nested in a district, which is nested in a community. And within all of this too, we have to remember the other sort of adjacent systems, right? So you have a student who's nested inside of a family, is nested inside of a peer group. And all of those things are going to influence potentially what could happen. That same piece, if we think about implicit bias, you know, every teacher, every administrator is nested inside of a set of systems. And so a question becomes like, how do we make sure we're acknowledging those systems? And again, like, see the system that produces the outcomes, like what around it is influencing the ways in which we think about the situation. And as a concrete example, there's a great book from Craig Watkins, who's a professor at the University of Texas in Austin. And he talks about the digital lives of Black and Latino youth. And in it, he says, the number of times a white student is labeled as an innovator and a Black or Latino student might be labeled as a hacker. And it's the exact same kinds of behavior, but there's that perception that comes with it. And so if we were to step back and say, you know, what is the system and how are we really looking at this, then the focus might be more on like, what are the actions, what is the context, and strategies to be able to mitigate that potential implicit bias.
Yeah, I think that one practice that we've definitely loved using is the equity pause, and especially when analyzing your data, taking a step back and asking, are there people's perspectives that aren't in this room that we should be elevating? In order to have that, right, you have to have a diverse team, have diverse stakeholders that you're able to reach out to. We all have blind spots, right? We all 100% do. We all have our own lived experiences. So making sure that the people that are looking at the data have a diverse perspective so that they're able to uncover, one of our colleagues at the Learning Accelerator is very, very an accessibility expert on things that I had no idea about. And anytime we're looking at something as a team, that is a lens that she is going to bring and elevate. And it's something that makes our data analysis stronger. And so how are we incorporating those practices in there? Beth Holland, brought up the example of hacker versus Andre, on there. And we also know that, disproportionately Black students are not labeled gifted, even if they have the same, these historical trends exist for a reason, right? Even though there's the same, even if students are performing the same, we know that they're on there. So how are we making sure that as we're looking at those data, these questions are being asked and interrogated and being elevated in a way?
And just so every district has that data that can tell them that, right? So the question is, but since it doesn't tell them that, it really gets back to this data being neutral, meaning that you actually have to act on it in order to find exactly what you're describing, meaning that you haven't necessarily asked that question, really challenged your own status quo. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
So speaking of bias and implicit bias, I'd love to sort of go back to a discussion we talked on earlier about implicit bias and AI during our webinar pre-conversation, which those of you who came in early may have heard a bit of. Beth started talking about the new Google assessment tool leveraging AI. Beth, do you want to talk a little bit about that, just to give context, just in case some of our attendees haven't heard about it, because it is quite new.
Sure. And I know as much as I saw in the 2-minute YouTube video announcing it, so please don't consider me an expert, but essentially there's a new feature that is coming out through Google for Education for Google Classroom, where the intention is, and this is it from a learning perspective, it is a good intention that students learn when they have opportunities for practice and they receive immediate feedback. At the same time, there's a challenge, right? Teachers have lots and lots of students, and sometimes it's really difficult to be able to provide that immediate feedback in a timely manner that's individualized to meet every student's needs. What the new feature, and I'm sure it has a fun Google name, which I cannot remember right now, what the new feature is essentially advocating is that if a teacher was to build an activity inside Google Classroom with a series of like multiple choice type questions, then Google's AI would be able to say, okay, based on this question, we can pull together these different resources. And if a student might be answering incorrectly, they might recommend scaffolding. If a student's answering correctly, they might be able to push that student ahead. And so it's the premise of an adaptive platform that's responding to the interactions that the student is having inside the system, which is a technology that's been around like since the early 2000s, right? This idea of these adaptive platforms, and they follow along and they provide hints and scaffolds and structures, and it can be a really amazing resource to provide to a student. Asking this question of, is data neutral? Then it becomes, there's some equity questions around that. It becomes like, what happens when a student only is receiving feedback from Google, but maybe not necessarily from a teacher as much anymore? What happens if the feedback was incorrect? Or what if the feedback was not picking up on any type of like a cultural miscue? Sandy, in a minute, I was thinking about your story about essays versus compositions. And so, what happens when it's not that a student is incorrect, but the algorithm isn't sophisticated enough to keep up with the student's thinking? And now what are the implications when a student is now being told that they might be incorrect when they could be correct? And then I think a last piece, which then I will step back and I'm going to let Tashawn and Sandy take over from here. But, what happens when essentially like every interaction that our students are having as they're learning and they're problem solving and they're thinking through things, on that back end of it, that's all now being tracked by Google. And so there are these questions around, if our students are constantly learning while they're being sort of monitored and tracked, what does that do to the learning process? There's some broader sort of existential questions to go with it. But Sandy, if you can tell about the composition versus essay, I think that was such a great example that gets at this.
Well, the story that I was telling it when we first met in order to get through, decide on the webinar and what we were going to talk about. My niece came up from the island of Jamaica, which I'm actually from. I'm from the island of Jamaica. And as I said previously, we're taught the British system. And one of the things was she was failing her classes. And one of the things that we came to a realization about was she couldn't understand what an essay was. She had no idea what it was. And we literally had to, which was great. I had to, a girlfriend of mine was a teacher in her school. And I actually had to explain to my friend, I was like, she has no idea what that is. She knows it as composition. Because in the English system, we were taught it's a composition you write, you don't write an essay. So those simple things, and I was even talking about even myself right now, there are certain words that I only think in the English vernacular of what I was raised in compared to, what we speak, we have here in the United States. So, understanding those things makes a big difference for a student that walks in and, comes from a different culture and doesn't understand exactly what they're reading. So I can tell you from my school district, we are extremely diverse. I mean, we have so many different ethnic groups in our community, which is really fantastic. But as we look at data, we have to be cognizant of the possibility that the data we're looking to and we're and not analyzing and doing, providing resources for these students may not be the right thing for the student, or may be misinterpreted by the student's actual culture and, even in the local community, this could be misinterpreted and misunderstood. One culture might think it's fine, and then another culture may think it's weird. I'm quite sure most of you know about the study that was done when doing the SATs and the PSATs, and some students not knowing what a saucer is comparing to knowing what is a regular plate. And I'm just going to leave that right there.
Yeah, so this is the one that really kind of I don't know if triggers is the right word, but AI in and of itself, like I'm a technology person, science fiction buff kind of person. I read a ton of dystopia and everything like that. And so I always kind of come from this space of, I feel like AI can really help, right? In a lot of different spaces and fill in a lot of gaps. But I always come back to, especially when we're discussing the construct, the core construct of AI really comes from algorithms and rules that are based on logic that really is seeded from people. So based on the definitions that a person comes from in terms to kind of solve some of these challenges, what does that turn into? Because the seed normally grows into some version of the same seed, meaning that if I feel that this is the answer and the solution for a majority of people, then the response that I give in terms of my outcome from a prescriptive standpoint, from an adaptive assessment, like I'm not going to mention any names, but any of the adaptive assessments that kind of live out there, then it will be accurate for a certain percentage, right? But then the other percentage, it doesn't necessarily take into account any level of differentiation, right? Or individualization that's absolutely needed in instruction. So it's not to say that AI can't close some gaps. It's just, again, if you were to boil it down all the way, it's based on rules and logic that come from people. So how do we take into account the rules and logic that the people have that they apply to it? Which really kind of goes back to an earlier statement that I made. And I'll answer the question that was asked earlier a little bit later, but and the question that was answered in the chat that I feel is somewhat related a little bit later, maybe doing the Q&A.
This is just such a great conversation, and so many things to discuss. We could go off on so many different directions. One thing I was thinking is, how do we ensure that educators develop algorithmic literacy so that they are aware of the potential for bias in AI systems, whether it be in adaptive assessment or in, say, like I'm just thinking about like proctoring systems, which I think are more common in higher ed, but they are, there's been a lot of research that shows that proctoring systems are known for, like for if they involve facial recognition, they are less accurate in identifying Black and brown faces than they are white ones. So there's lots of areas in our life where AI is being used where there have been, there's evidence of bias. So how can we ensure that educators are aware of this potential so that they can respond appropriately? Beth, I'm going to toss that question over to you first, because I know you have opinions.
It's funny, I had not thought about algorithmic literacy as a concept until I attended a workshop with Renee Hobbs, who does a lot of digital literacy, media literacy work several years ago. And she had started talking about it with search engines, and which I'm going to date myself because I was teaching when search engines like first kind of became a thing. And I actually remember teaching middle school students how to do an internet search in like 2000, must have been 2005. So these were early days still. And one of the, if you remember as well, there's always that danger of like doing a search engine search in front of a group of middle schoolers. Like, let's just sort of leave it at that. So I will let all of you know that my go-to search in front of a group of middle schoolers at any point in time is always, in quotation marks, German Shepherd puppy. Like, you're going to get little black and brown fuzzy things that show up with an image search. You're going to get information about dogs. You'll get like the American Kennel Club. Like, it's a really safe search. But where I remember I was teaching it to the students and we were using the curriculum from the Kentucky Virtual Library about like, this was old school Boolean searches. And I'm like, okay, guys, do we want a German Shepherd, meaning black and brown fuzzy dog, or a shepherd of Germanic descent, not a search engine search to do in front of a group of middle schoolers. So just to have to get them to stop at that point and have them have this question about, well, how do we know and what's behind it? And then we could start digging into those kinds of activities of like, if everybody searches, do we all get the same thing? And so sometimes like that search engine is a great entry point with teachers who may not even know. I think there's still, I was working as an adjunct a couple of years ago, and I was working with a group of teachers that really didn't know the difference between a browser and a search engine. Like sometimes we have to remember those really basic digital literacy skills, or as my mother called one time and said, who is Siri and why does she know everything, right? Like, do we know what are we using as the search engine in our phones? Like, is Siri searching Google, or like I've switched everything to DuckDuckGo? Like, those are all decisions to make. And so at that starting point with teachers, like search engines are kind of a clear-cut space where we can start to have those conversations. But making sure that we're really not just teaching our teachers, but our students to question the algorithm. Like, if I get something and you get something and it's not the same thing, how come? And we can start in those really basic kind of things. And I've seen, it was Peter Senge from MIT had a video years ago about systems thinking in elementary schools. And he had these like little second graders going, well, it's the algorithm. And I'm thinking, if a second grader can learn it, then I'm sure that we can all find a way to start thinking about it. But I would start with search engines.
I have a follow-up for Beth Holland on that one. I'm curious, it's like, right now teachers are, asked to be so much and for everything on there. And like, not everyone is going to necessarily be a technology savvy or other there. Are there ways that this can be easily incorporated? Is this something that, is there like a digital literacy 101 PD that all teachers need to take? Or is it just kind of, having these conversations? Like, where do you see this like potentially happening?
I'm gonna take a loaded question with another loaded question. I can't tell you how much I learned by actually talking to my librarian. Like, don't forget that we have really amazing experts in schools and in communities, and librarians are phenomenal. And public librarians, I think we often forget what a tremendous resource that they can be. And I completely agree with you that teachers have enough on their plates, and the last thing that you want to do is say, oh, and you're also going to teach. It's like when digital citizenships first became like a thing, and everyone's like, everybody teaches digital citizenship, and teachers were like, you've got to be kidding me. But if there were ways, that it does really fit inside of a curriculum, the middle school teachers doing a research project, then there's a digital literacy, algorithmic literacy component, or the history social studies teacher. I taught in a really small school, and it was amazing how much we could get done when we actually had teachers talk to each other like across department, and suddenly be like, hey, instead of the English study and the history research paper, what if we do one? And like, look, everyone gets a couple of weeks back in their lives. I think except for me and the librarian, but that was fine. That was what we had signed up for. So I hear you, and I think you're right. And I also am wondering, like, how do we really empower like some of those extra experts that we have inside of our communities?
And Jinsu, one of the other things, just to answer your question, I appreciate that, Beth, because that helped me to point in a direction that I haven't thought of in a while, is that there are some state and federal tech standards by ISTE specific to digital literacy. And there's portions of this that can be handled through induction, right? But also there needs to be conversations, like you were mentioning, at schools to kind of determine what the student impact is. Because oftentimes we forget that, the whole reason that we have education is for students. So what is the impact of having this conversation on students, not just the adults, as part of the conversation? So those two things, but specific to the standards, because if the state has adopted the standards, it's something that we kind of should be doing anyway. So whoever's responsible or kind of in that space really needs to push for this in their district. I know that we've been doing a drip campaign specific to digital media literacy. And I know other surrounding districts have actually incorporated that into their strategic plan and goals to make sure that each student is media literate, so that they can advance and be able to be, again, we won't say 20th century students, because we're deep into the 20th century now. So, 21st century, excuse me. And so it should already be a conversation that's being had, but I found that in a lot of places it isn't.
I mean, I was even thinking, I had a conversation, I don't know, time has blended together over the last years. Sometime in the last couple of years, there was a conversation, but even about like digital literacy and algorithmic literacy and medical. And the example at that time was thinking about, I don't know how many of you have a medical provider where there's a portal now, and like everything that a person without medical experience should never be able to see, like lab results, things that like you shouldn't know what the different numbers mean because you have no ability to be able to properly interpret. Again, the data itself is neutral. Your inability to understand it is what creates a lot of stress and headache. But, you know, even understanding too, how are we, you know, partnering with healthcare providers and recognizing that there are other people, like the digital space has expanded beyond so much more than school, and the algorithms do have an effect. And I mean, even we can bring it back to tech providers. Lately, I have been arguing with my watch ad nauseum. The watch and I are having serious debates. It tells me I'm rested. I'm not rested. I'm telling it it's crazy. It tells me I had a recovery day. I'm like, are you out of your mind? Do you not know what I did today? Like, we need to understand, like, there are other ways that we could even think about introducing these ideas to students as we look at this, you know, look at the data.
Well, it's funny. One of the things I wanted to bring up when we were talking about algorithms and everything else, recently I presented with actually a student and a couple of other people on a panel discussion when we were talking about it was a part of something called Tech for Good. And we were talking about digital citizenship, and we were talking about how the algorithms are being used in some of our social media platforms, and the information that's being given out to kids via TikTok or any other one of them. I don't care whichever one it is, but the information that students that are going on it and taking a look at it, and they're typing in something, and then the information that they're getting back is not beneficial. It's actually harmful, and it can lead to students. You know, one of the things we're looking at was self-images. You know, students, you know, all of a sudden starting to look at something, and, you know, rather than it being something beneficial, they now have a self-image that makes it more harmful for them than something positive. So the one thing about the algorithm that we have to realize, and Tishan hit the nail on the head when he said, we have to realize they're written by us, and we have our own implicit biases, and realizing that that is what's going to be, you know, what the results are going to be coming, you know, via looking at data and giving that information to us. I mean, even something simple as Amazon. I mean, I've gotten so many recommendations for Amazon for stuff. I'm like, where are you getting all this stuff? Because this has nothing to do with what I want, you know? And it's, the reason being is that the algorithm is reading what I am typing in to search for, whatever it is, incorrectly. And I suppose because that comes from my cultural background, and what I'm looking for is not something that Amazon itself understands, you know. So because of that, I think that's why sometimes, to be honest with you, sometimes I don't use Amazon because of that reason, because I get frustrated and that type of thing. And that's the reason why I don't use Siri or a lot of the voice, because there's certain words I pronounce that sounds very differently. And if you ever, you know, I've done voice texting and landed up almost getting into trouble because it misinterpreted the entire word and sent out something that I was like shocked. Yeah. So that's it, talking about algorithms.
Yeah. So if we ask the question about whether or not students or young people understand the algorithm, I would encourage you to ask anyone about YouTube. Ask them about the YouTube algorithm, because I know I had a long conversation with my son several years ago, and he was about 12 at the time. And, you know, he was wanting to publish videos and do that type of thing. And he said that, you know, I need to use these words in my metadata in order to determine where I sat in the algorithm so that my things can be viewed. And I was like, so explain to me, what you're basically describing to me is that you're gaming the algorithm, right? He's like, yeah, so I have to, you know, put these words in because they're popular words. And those words are probably based on something that someone was thinking was important, and it's given a certain amount of weight. right? So if you put that in the context of an assessment, let's say, right? If I answer the question in an incorrect way, the same type of way, and it puts me in a larger group, then I'm always going to get those results. Similar to what Sandra was saying with Amazon. It's saying people like you have, people who have looked at these things have, and so you get lumped in and grouped in based on some criteria that was based on the algorithm, which is based on someone's understanding. But I encourage you to ask anyone who has spent any time with YouTube below a certain age what they think about the algorithm, either YouTube or Spotify. Those two are pretty big about their use of algorithms and how they suggest things to you.
Well, that is absolutely fascinating. But I hadn't even realized that you could add metadata to videos like that. I mean, that's
Yeah, it's in your description. So whatever the words that you write in your description of what the video is,
fascinating.
that's basically used as metadata to drive the search. And so they figured all of that out based on just basic context. So
Wow.
our kids know a lot more than we think they do at times.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really great point. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Maybe we can go back to Sean, to the question that was asked earlier in the chat. Ken had a very good question going back to our question about implicit bias. If I understand what Tashawn was saying, is that data can perhaps highlight or provide insights into implicit bias. If that's not the case, isn't the data then itself not neutral? In other words, if the neutrality of the data is compromised by the implicit bias of those who collected it?
Yeah, so I appreciate the question. I feel like something I said earlier was that data is a reflection of fact, and not necessarily saying truth, but fact. So this data neutral, I think what I'm meaning is that we're stating a fact at a moment in time, and that people give the context and meaning, which kind of shift that neutrality. So when data provides insights to implicit bias, the insight is actually gleaned by the person, right? Because that's where insights normally come from, unless we're talking about AI again, but that's still algorithm based on the person. And the reason I would say that is I could look at the same data that you would look at, and I would potentially see something different. So what impact is the data actually having on me? We're both looking at the same thing. We see two different things. The common denominator is the fact that the common factor, is the fact that we are both different people, but looking at the same thing. So it's funny that something that I've heard over the last couple of decades is that, and this is just a parallel example, is that technology is a tool, right? Meaning that the same technology can be used to solve a myriad of problems, but it's also a statement to reduce technology as a driver for instruction in ed tech. And I've seen that kind of as a practitioner, seeing that as a thing. Someone will say, well, technology is the tool, so the technology is not important. I feel like data is the same, especially in that descriptive phase. Data is a tool, right? So back to something I said earlier, what challenge are you trying to solve? What question are you trying to answer? And then what data are you collecting in that space? Now, the data itself is just a statement of fact, but then the person, again, determines based on their context, based on what they understand about the data sources and such, their expertise, experience, their own bias, cultural, social pressures even, right? And culture will determine what you see. But that's what you see, which is your insight. But the data itself isn't necessarily telling you that. So regardless of who captured the data, they're capturing a version of fact, right? And then we determine what the truth is, or at least what we see the truth is as part of that fact. So I don't know if that necessarily answers your question, but hopefully it gives you a little bit more context into the why behind that statement. Yeah, I hope that does.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for asking that question, Ken. And also just wanted to say, I know we're coming up at the end of our time, so we'll be wrapping things up. I just wanted to just ask our panelists before we close out, if you have any final thoughts on the topic of bias and equity with regard to our use of data in schools.
Let Sandra go.
The one thing I was going to say was is understand we can use data, but we can only use data as a tool, and it's in order for descriptive reasons only, and not for actually because there's so many other aspects of the data itself, that we have to realize, but also understanding that we do have implicit bias ourselves as we are doing data analysis and we're doing interpretations and everything else, whether we do it or whether the computer systems do it, with AI and algorithms and stuff like that, whichever way it comes, and we decide to use it for certain contexts and everything else, we have to realize that there's a possibility of bias within it. And with that possibility, the whole idea is when we want to use it for prescriptive purposes, or even like for scaffolding, for instruction, or whatever it is, we have to realize that it's not going to answer every single question. It is not supposed to be the one thing that can cure all and be all for everything. It's not supposed to be that way. It's supposed to be something just as Tashawn said, it's like almost like a tool to be used, but understanding that there is a possible background implicit bias or an algorithm that it's not going to be interpreting the data according to what you think it should.
Thank you so much, Sandy. Beth, did you have any final thoughts?
I was waiting to see if anyone else had ideas. I
Around everyone.
Okay, well, I mean, I will give one piece. We were just having this conversation as a team earlier today, is really remembering as well that, data isn't just numbers, but like data is also stories. And that's that balance between, we have the quantitative and the qualitative. And, as Tashawn had mentioned, we have to understand context. And as Sandy brought up, we have to really understand that, there's culture and there's bias. And I think, as educators, how are we making sure that we're taking a really holistic view on what we consider data and then how we're applying it? And I think too, as we look at different platforms, we look at things that are using data, not just what does the number say, but what's the story behind it and what story does it help us tell? And I think that can help us take a more balanced perspective on it.
So I think I'll jump in real quick before, if you don't mind, Jinsu. Okay, yeah. So I think the one thing that I'll kind of leave us with is that the danger of implicit bias is when it's used to make descriptive data into predictive data just by an action, right? Meaning that since the data is telling me this, I will do that, right? I think we need to observe the process that generated the data and the people involved to help provide additional context before we take action. Because one of our system's other data beliefs is that bad process equals bad data. That's one of the things that we have that's involved, which really accounts for the fact that some of the implicit bias, system understanding, culture, and history go into the data that's captured. So understanding that that is a dangerous place, and that if we try to turn descriptive data into predictive data, that's really a breeding ground for implicit bias and the continuation of systemic challenges that will lead to students not being successful, at least all students not being successful.
Yeah, I think I'll build on what Tashawn said and just note that we have to remember that even if machines and algorithms are spitting things out and visualizing and crunching the numbers for us and suggesting things, those are all human created systems and processes. So we have to remember, it's not just a machine saying this. And while the machines themselves may not have bias, the people who created these processes and systems, ranging all the way from AI, even to just, I gave an exit ticket today as a teacher, and I generated the exit ticket. Those were all choices that were made and based on human decisions, and we all have those. So how do you make sure that you're diversifying those perspectives so that the choices that are made take into as many different lenses as possible?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for an absolutely fascinating conversation today with our panelists. You guys are all rock stars. Really appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts with us today. I'm going to turn things over to Jonathan right now to close things out. Jonathan?
Yes, thank you all so much for being here. I want to thank all of our panelists for an amazing discussion. I'm going to close out with a few items here. If you have additional questions or want to keep talking with us, here is the Project Unicorn Twitter handle. I've also included our organizational partner on this webinar, the Learning Accelerator. We want to keep having these conversations and to promote events that you want to see. So please tweet at us, keep the conversation going, and we look forward to chatting with you some more. Additionally, our next webinar is the Great Data State Series North Dakota. We'll be traveling virtually to North Dakota to hear how the North Dakota Department of Public Instruction utilizes data interoperability and the blockchain in their K-12 data ecosystem. It's going to be really interesting and a fun little vacation for all of us to go on. So join us. These links will be in the chat, and we'll be following up with all of this information, including a link to the recording of this session after the webinar has concluded. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to the panelists. And we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Have a great day.